So my name is Anthony Apostolidis. I'm the Vice President of the Catalan Company, a student-created organization that basically exists to spread our love for and knowledge of, or growing knowledge of, I might say, the Catalan culture, the region in Spain. So with that, I would like to invite our esteemed advisor, Dr. Guterres, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Anthony. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Bienvenidos, benvinguts. Thank you so much for being here. I see a lot of familiar faces, and I'm sending a big hola to Amanda Oldemolin Subirats, the professor who inspired students in creating, I think, the Catalan Company. And of course, happy International Women's Day. We are so lucky to have here with us to my esteemed former professor, Dr. Kathleen McNerney. Thank you so much for dedicating us giving us some of your time. But let me tell you a little bit more about Dr. McNerney. Dr. Kathleen McNerney is Professor Emerita of Hispanic Studies, Women's Studies, and Humanities from West Virginia University, where she received titles of Benedum Distinguished Scholar and Singer Professor of the Humanities. She was awarded several prizes in Catalonia as well, such as the Premi Batista y Roca from the Institut de Projecció Exterior of Catalan Culture. She is a broad-based scholar whose publications include works on Latin American, French, and Castilian literatures, but the majority deal with Catalan women writers. She co-edited many books and issues such as Double Minorities of Spain, Visions and Revisions, Women's Narrative in 20th Century Spain, published by Rodopi, and the former one by MLA. She compiled Merced Rodoreda, a selected and annotated bibliography, published in 2015. And she also translates. She has translated a number of works in various genres, from Catalan into English. Her latest publications are Silent Souls and Other Stories by Katarina Albert, published by MLA in 2018. And lately, she has translated The Passion According to René Vivien by Maria Mercel, published in 2020. She also has an ongoing role in a very interesting project. It's the Multiple Versions Project, in which poetry is translated from original minoritized languages into commonly used languages. And just today in the Modern Languages Department, we had an event for Women's Day as well about Irish. So something we should connect you with, Dr. McNerney. She continues to give presentations to academic organizations in the United States, in Catalonia, and elsewhere. And she is a true inspiration for me. She's the reason why somebody from the middle of centralized Spain started to have an interest in Catalan language and culture and literature. And when I asked, when Dr. McNerney was retiring, I asked her, are you going to continue publishing and researching? And she said to me, I'm retired, I'm not dead. So this is an example of somebody who has such a true passion, who can retire so she can keep working. You're an inspiration, Dr. McNerney. Thank you so much. And the floor is yours. Thank you so much. And we can ask maybe questions at the end.
Thank you very much to Elena Gutierrez and the Catalan Company, Andrew and his colleagues, and also to my sister Rosemary, who's here helping me with technological things and many other things. I'll start out with a brief introduction to Catalan, and then I'll concentrate on specific Catalan women writers. By the way, if you're interested in news about Catalonia, This is an excellent source right here, vilaweb.cat. It's an online newspaper that you can access very easily, and it tells you what's happening day to day with all kinds of events in the Catalan world. Catalan is a Romance language derived from Latin and is spoken today by about 10 million people, mostly in the eastern portion of the Iberian Peninsula. The old Principality of Catalonia, Eastern Aragon, and the Kingdom of Valencia, in addition to the Principality of Andorra, the only country whose only official language is Catalan, the Balearic Islands, and Roussillon in southern France, and the city of Alghero in Sardinia. It's also preserved by many speakers of the language who've immigrated to all parts of the world, North and South America, all over Europe and Australia. Catalan is a highly uniform language, but one that nevertheless has important dialectical manifestations. It enjoys co-official status with Spanish in the regions of Spain where it's spoken natively. The Spanish cities of Barcelona and Valencia would be the principal urban centers where Catalan language and culture thrive. But going north to south and east and west, north of Barcelona would be Perpignan in southern France, which has a colony of Catalan speakers. And then to the east of Barcelona, Palma de Mallorca, and to the west, Lleida, and to the south, Alicante, and even a little further south of Alicante. In the Middle Ages, the political, cultural, and linguistic influence of Catalans extended through much of southern France and the Mediterranean region, Sicily, Sardinia, in Italy, for example, and even parts of Greece came under Catalan control in the 14th century. Catalonia has flourished compared to other European stateless cultures, for example, the Gaelic languages that Elena just referred to. But it's always been a struggle to be themselves and not a subcategory or other. After the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, Catalan was banned from public use. And when I first went to Spain, I saw a sign that said, "No ladres, habla idioma del imperio." Don't bark, speak the language of the empire. People were fined and books were burned. But since 1975, and then later the transition in the late 70s, there was a normalization. And the most important aspect of that normalization, I believe, was teaching in Catalan in the schools. There is an industrial base in Barcelona and Valencia as well. And so there is a possibility of independence. We can get back to that later. But Barcelona and Valencia have always had a Mediterranean orientation. They, Catalan speaking areas, those països catalans, extends almost the entire coast, Mediterranean coast of Spain. And they've always been seafaring and somewhat looking towards France for inspiration culturally rather than Madrid. It was absorbed into Spain then in the late 15th century when the Catholic kings, the Catholic monarchs, I should say, came together. And unification can be a very good thing, but sometimes it's very bad news for minorities if the dominant power dominates too much. And then definitively in the War of Spanish Succession in 1714, it was really absorbed into the Spanish state. The first writer I'm going to talk about, and I'm going back deliberately far back, because people have the idea that women started writing in the 19th century, and it's not true. We have a couple of medieval tradition of troubadours represented in Catalan by the Reina de Mallorcas in the 14th century. Now, my friend Silvia Aymeric told me that that wasn't really Catalan that she wrote in, it was Occitan, and that was the popular poetic language of the day. But I thought it was Catalan when I translated it. The Reina de Mallorcas then, we're not exactly sure who she was. She had to have been the queen married to Jaume III of Mallorca, but there were more than one. But we think it's Constance Arago. And as I said, she wrote in the troubadour tradition, and she wrote a lovely poem to her husband who was far away, complaining that he was far away. And I'll read that to you. It's typical in the troubadour tradition also because it has a tornada at the end that kind of sums things up. She says, I love the one who's good and lovely, and I'm happy like a white bird who sings its song for love. I am woman and sovereign, and my beloved mustn't regret, for I'm the best of all lovers, and I've chosen the worthiest, the best in the world, and I love him so that just thinking of him, I see him and hold him. But when it isn't really so, I'm besieged by such despair, for I know he's far away in France. And then she starts directing herself directly to this husband. She says, I miss and want you so much, it's killing me, my sweet Lord. I might soon die for you, for whom I so love and desire, if I don't see you coming back soon, for I miss so much the embraces and the talking and everything. And when I think about you leaving and not coming back and about how far away you are, my heart falls into despair. I'm about to die if I don't get cured soon. And then the tornada says, mercy, my husband, I'm suffering so from the pain you cause. So come back. No treasure can be worth a heart that's dying for you with thoughts of love. A little bit more critical tradition. There were two traditions contemporary to that 13th, 14th, and even into the 15th centuries called the Malmonjadas, which were nuns who didn't want to be nuns, and Malcasadas, who were married but didn't want to be married, or at least not to the one they were married to. And this short poem goes like this. Alas, it would have been better for me to marry or to have a courtly sweetie than to be a nun. I'm a nun to my sorrow. Those who stuck me here did me great harm. And in my opinion, may God give them a bad year. If I'd only known, but I was naive, I wouldn't have entered the convent even if they offered me all of Montagut. Okay, now we're going to take a huge leap into the 19th century, and there's a reason for that. The 18th century was not particularly productive for creative writing. It was a time of treatises and scientific exploration. So in the 19th century, we have a wonderful writer called Katarina Albert, also known as Victor Català. She was from a small town in the very northernmost part of Catalonia, near the French border. And she was a painter as well as a writer. Both Katarina Albert and then a little bit later, Merced Rodoreda, were stellar Catalan cultural figures, a couple of generations apart. They're both best known for narrative. Both were polyphacetic and productive in other forms of writing and art. They were both painters. Katarina Albert wrote two novels. The most famous one is called Solitude. She wrote several collections of stories, plays, and poems. She also loved the cinema and was influenced by it in her writing and painting. These are examples, if you can see that, of some of her paintings. She was from a wealthy landowning family in the Costa Brava. She attended school only briefly, for she was impatient with teaching and teaching methods and subjects. She hired her own tutors, especially in art, and learned to paint in the styles that were popular in her day. But she was eclectic and sui generis in many ways. I'm trying to read something on the screen here. It's just hello from Julia. Hello to you. Merced Rodoreda then, a few generations later, knew Albert's work and admired her greatly. The two had much in common: little formal education, a love for films, and art production that until recently hasn't been studied. Rodoreda's writing also includes all genres, including the essay. She started out as a journalist, and we'll get back to her, but for right now, I want to read you some translations of Katarina Albert, where she talks about her own work. In 1898, she won 2 literary prizes in a contest in Olot. The first one was for her poem El Libro No, the new book, which is a little bit evocative of Pablo Neruda's Oda al Diccionario, which is about his love for books. When she was interviewed later on, she said, "I was given the award." This is for the Infanticida monologue that she wrote. "I was given the award. There were fantastic arguments about who the author of the work was. Apparently it was a bold, daring monologue. I didn't realize it. When they found out the author was a woman, the scandal was worse. They thought it unacceptable for me to write about an infanticide. But can the work of an artist have limits? I don't believe art can be restrained by moral norms. I believe it's fundamental to advocate for artistic freedom. Thanks to this independence, I've been faithful to my vocation, in which everyone has tried to intervene," end quote. She talks a little bit later about the pressure on her to use styles that were popular at the time. And she says about that, "We prefer to work than to theorize, even though action might result defective while theory seems perfect. For too much theory creates traps and hindrances to the free impulse of action." And now I'm going to get back to Merced Rodoreda, who was from Barcelona. And her most famous novel is La Plaça del Diamant, which has been translated into almost 40 languages, including 3 different versions in English, and also made into a film, La Plaça del Diamant, which is kind of a trilingual experience because it was made in Catalan, but then has subtitles in Spanish and voiceover here and there in English. On a number of occasions, Merced Rodoreda spoke and wrote about her own work. In interviews, letters, and prologues, sometimes with doses of whimsy and fantasy, she was often willing to discuss certain aspects of her fiction. She mentioned her favorite authors and speculated about who may have influenced her writing. She called herself una bestia literaria, a literary beast. And in fact, despite her little formal education, she was extremely well-read. I'm going to read you some quotations then from a prologue she wrote to the novel Broken Mirror, with a couple of caveats. First of all, writers are not generally considered to be the most judicious critics of their own work. And second, Rodoreda is complex and at times full of contradictions. So she's trying to answer the question of why writers write, which might not have an answer, but she had a few ideas on the subject. In 1973, she told Montserrat Roig, another very well-known Catalan writer, she says, "Writing is like a sedative to me. It's a stimulant. It produces anxiety. It's everything at once. Writing makes me very tired. I need it. After all, one has to do something in life. But what I really like is to let the clouds enchant me, or read detective novels, or go to the movies and see a Western. That's my favorite kind." End quotation. At first glance, it seems like a frivolous answer, and yet, as on so many occasions, her words are deceptively simple. While suggesting that she writes in order to escape from boredom, she lets us know that writing is hard work. It's a message she repeats many times, and in fact, she was a notoriously careful writer, correcting and revising endlessly. She didn't discount inspiration, and she made a distinction between those chapters that seem to write themselves and those that are a terrible struggle. Rodoreda often began with a visual image, and she has this in common with Garcia Marquez, for example. In her case, it's particularly interesting because she was also a painter, and I'll show you one example of her work. The example she gives of this phenomenon of starting with a visual image is very clear in Broken Mirror, in a chapter called Eladi Farriol's Laying in Wake. It was supposed to be the first chapter of the novel before characters had names and plots were developed. It turned out to be something quite different later on in the novel, but those are exceptional cases, inspiration coming from a visual image. And she attributes to Paul Valéry the more realistic belief that inspiration, and I quote, "Inspiration comes from writing. As you write, writing or thinking about what you're going to write exalts you, and maybe inspiration comes from writing," end quote. More reflective and introspective when writing a prologue than when giving an interview, she has a somewhat different answer to the same question, why writers write. She says, "I write because I like to write. If it didn't seem exaggerated, I'd say that I write to like myself. If on top of that other people like what I write, all the better. Maybe it's deeper. Maybe I write to affirm myself, to feel that I exist, that's all. I've spoken about myself and about essential things in my life with a certain lack of moderation, and that always scares me a lot." End quotation. While these less than candid words cannot answer the unanswerable question either about why writers write, they do serve as an interesting example of escritura parlada, spoken writing, that many of her critics have written about, especially focusing on La Plaza del Diamant, where the protagonist talks to herself throughout a great deal of the novel. And Rodoreda doesn't mind exaggerating as long as she tells you she's exaggerating. And she doesn't mind a lack of moderation as long as she tells you she's being immoderate. Moreover, nobody should believe a writer who claims not to care about pleasing the reader. In Rodoreda's case, there's plenty of documentation about her reactions to being passed over for one prize after another. But perhaps the most meaningful quotation on this subject was suggested to her when, as a young writer, a journalist, she told the director of the journal she was working for that she wanted to learn how to write through journalism. He said, and she quoted him more than once, "Primer visci, després escrivi." First live, then write. Since most of Rodoreda's writing is in the form of novels, and since she addresses a number of intriguing aspects of her novelistic production at the beginning of this poetic prologue to Broken Mirror, I think it's worth quoting, and then we can analyze some of her words. She says, "A novel is made of a great quantity of intuitions, a certain quantity of imponderables, agonies and resurrections of the spirit, exaltations, disappointments, reserves of involuntary memory, an entire alchemy. If I'd never felt moved by a sunset, How could I describe or suggest the magic of a sunset? The streets have always inspired me, like a scene from a good film, like a park in the burst of springtime, or frosty and skeletal in winter, like good music heard at a certain moment, like the faces of some completely unknown people whose path you cross, who attract you and you'll never see again. That's why they leave you in a kind of regret difficult to explain in words. A hand in a painting can give you a whole character. A glance can impress you more than the beauty of a pair of eyes. An enigmatic smile that sometimes can be just a contraction of certain facial nerves can steal your heart, and you need to make it last. You think, if I could describe that little bit of a movement, almost imperceptible, that changes the whole expression. Stendhal said, details are the most important thing in a novel. And Chekhov said, you have to attempt the impossible, to say things in a way that no one has said them before. It's difficult to make a novel. The structure, the characters, the scene, the task of choosing is exalting because it obliges you to overcome difficulties. There are novels that impose themselves on you. Others you have to pull out of a bottomless well. A novel is words. I'd like to show you the very slow spasms of a shoot as it emerges from a branch, the violence with which a plant expels its seed, the savage immobility of Uccello's horses, the extreme expressivity of the androgynous smiles of Leonardo da Vinci's virgins, the provocative gaze, the most provocative gaze in the world of one of Cranach's ladies, without eyebrows or eyelashes, wearing a beret with ostrich feathers. I haven't gotten that far. It's difficult to write well. By writing well, I mean saying essential things with maximum simplicity. It's not always possible. To highlight each word, even the most anodyne, can shine brilliantly if you put it in the right place. When a sentence comes out with a different twist, I feel a little victorious. Writing depends on choosing the right means of expression, style. Some writers find it right away, others take a long time, some never find it. End of quotation. In the first sentence, Rodoreda likens writing to alchemy. The metaphor is particularly apt, suggesting a combination of magic and dedication. And it's one thing she comes back to on various occasions. In the conclusion of the same prologue, she describes her efforts to flee from all that is noxious to her soul while cultivating an admiration for all that is uplifting. She says, she seeks the quiet power of flowers that bring me ineffable moments, for the slow patience of precious stones, the greatest purity of the earth, for the great abysses of this sky, at once so near and so far, where all the constellations shine and tremble. End quotation. Perhaps Rodorreda's interest in the esoteric will allow us to stretch this metaphor a little bit by suggesting that her writing represents her search for the philosopher's stone. Or as she describes the work of other writers she greatly admires, she says, they're men of highest category who chiseled at the quarry of the language and uncovered veins of pure gold. Perhaps she too, with great dedication, has succeeded in turning stone into gold. I'm going to talk a couple minutes now about the poet that Professor Gutierrez mentioned, Maria Merced Mercel. She was a very dear friend of mine. She was from Lleida and very hardworking. She had founded a publication house when she was 21 years old. She wrote the one novel, The Passion According to René Vivien, which is about a French poet. And I'm going to read a couple things by her. This is something she wrote when she was very young, and it's very short, so I'm going to read it in Catalan so you'll get an idea of the language. She says, al atzar agareixo tres dons, haver nascut dona, de classe baixa y nació oprimida, y el terror atzur de ser tres voltas rebel, which in English is, I'm grateful to chance for three gifts, having been born a woman, of low class and oppressed nation, and the turbid blue of being 3 times a rebel. Okay, since today is the 8th of March, I'll read her poem named The 8th of March. With both hands raised up to the moon, let's open a window in that closed sky. Heirs to the women they burned yesterday, let's make a bonfire of ravage and fear. Witches of all ages will come. They'll leave their brooms to feed the fire, basins and kitchen rags and soap and bleach and pots and pans, mops and diapers. Let's leave brooms to feed the fire, pots and pans, bleach and soap. The ashes that remain we won't trade for gold or iron, for scepters or daggers. Born of the flame, we will have only life as arms and shields in both hands. The smoke will trace the beginnings of history like jeweled ivory around our bodies. It will rain and be sunny, and we'll dance to the music of new songs that the earth will receive. We will take back the night and the word woman. Then the tree of liberation will grow. And I'll read the very last poem she wrote. It's very short. First in Catalan, res no et serà pres. Vendran tan sols l'instant d'obrir dòcilment la mà i alliberar la memòria de l'agua d'alta mar. In English, nothing will be taken from you. The moment will come on its own to open your hand softly, to liberate the memory of water, to return to the water of the high sea. And finally, I want to talk about another very good friend who's working very hard. I think she's listening here somehow, Silvia Aymeric. And I can tell you that she's very hardworking because I've collaborated with her, and that's when you get to know if somebody's hardworking or not. She's a poet, writes fiction, teaches science, and is a translator. As Professor Gutierrez mentioned, she's very involved in a project called Multiple Versions, which I'll talk about in a minute. She, her very first early translation was Bram Stoker's Dracula. That had to be fun. She's very interested in marginal languages. And so again, I'll read 2 of her poems, a very old one and a very new one. The old one goes like this. If words ever stopped fascinating me, I'll kick their blocks off. I'll discover their inner taste, insipid or crude, the intimately hidden lament, the tender blooming of their secret. And then a very recent poem called Quercus Ilex, which is a reference to oak trees. And the reference to Gabriela is the Chilean poet Gabriela Mistral. So she says that tiny dot of yang inside the yinness of the soul is certainly as virile as the holly's coriaceous leaves, as sharp, incisive, even stinging, and yet so intimately those of a she tree. Firmly they stand while the he oak falls apart and abandons himself to 1,000 histrionic sheddings. Your leaves remain as undamaged as hers, Gabriela, discreetly perennial. The Multiple Versions project is accessible here, if you can see this. It's a Google site, just site / multiple versions. And they're always seeking new people. It's a group that does translations from minority languages to better known languages. And there are many participants in this project. Anyone can join and offer their expertise. I'll tell you just very briefly how it started. The idea arose just at the heart of Europe during the conference on language, literature, and nation organized by the Magyar Pen Club in Budapest in 2012, coinciding happily with the 90th anniversary of the Catalan Pen Club and the Girona Manifesto on Linguistic Rights. The website opens up a window to the fruitful exchange among at least 50 international authors, translators, and many collaborators translating literary texts into more than 20 languages, moved by that rounded organ, the size of a fist, to which scientists increasingly agree we should entrust life's greatest decisions. And we started out this project with a Welsh poem that was translated into English and then into Catalan. And the poem is by Menna Elfyn, who's the poet laureate of Wales, and she writes in Welsh. And the poem in English is called Teaching Dylan Thomas's Muse to Speak Welsh. The reference is that Dylan Thomas, when he went to school, they didn't teach Welsh, so he didn't learn it, but now they do. The title can hardly be more eloquent, an excellent lesson for the most reluctant muses.
Thank you very, very much. Really appreciate your time and the perspectives that you mentioned today. This is really interesting. But thank you for coming out, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event, which will be taking place end of April. Basically a poetry celebration. And we'll be inviting several of the other student language organizations on campus to join us as we celebrate poetry in their original languages.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I very much enjoyed it. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.